When you finish up new hire training and you get assigned a base, you're gonna be put on reserve. When there's a lot of hiring occurring, you may only be on reserve for a few months. But when hiring is slow, you may be stuck on reserve for months or even years. So what is reserve and what will it mean for you as a new airline pilot? If you're considering a career as an airline pilot, hit the subscribe button down below and turn on the notification bell. I'll be uploading more content like this, filled with inside information on airline pilot life. When pilots bid for schedules, there's usually more pilots in the base than there are needed to cover the flying that is scheduled. However, this is necessary because the extra pilots are going to be awarded a reserve schedule. They'll be the pilots that get called in to cover for somebody else when people call in sick or have emergencies, when there's unforeseen repositioning flights, or when weather or other irregular operations throw a wrench in the normal flight schedules. As a new reserve pilot, that doesn't mean that you're gonna be on reserve every day of the month. If you get a reserve schedule, you're gonna be on reserve 18 to 19 days of the month, with the other 10 to 13 days of the month off completely. During those 18 to 19 days of reserve during the month, you may or may not get called to fly. How much reserve pilots get used fluctuates month to month and base to base, but in general, you can count on getting called to go fly more as a reserve pilot during busy months like summer, December for the holidays, and March for spring break. Instead of getting paid based on how much you actually fly as a reserve pilot, you're gonna get paid a monthly guarantee. For most regional airlines, this is about 75 hours of pay for the month. Whether you fly 15 hours or 75 hours in the month, you're gonna get paid the same amount. If you live in base and you don't get called to fly very much, that can work out pretty well because you're essentially getting paid to sit at home. Some senior pilots will even choose to bid reserve so that they can do just that. They sit at home, do their hobbies, do whatever they're gonna do, and get paid while they're doing it. However, if you're commuting to base and you don't get called to fly very often, that can get pretty frustrating really quickly because you're just sitting in a city where you don't live, waiting to get called to go fly. Reserve is generally broken up into two different types: short call and long call. As the name suggests, if you're on short call reserve, you need to be able to get from wherever you're at to the airport and through security within a short period of time, usually a minimum of a 2-hour call out. Now, by the time you factor in getting ready, getting to the airport, riding on the employee shuttle, getting through security, all of that adds up and you don't have a whole lot of wiggle room. So you really need to be pretty ready to go out the door when you get a phone call from the company to go fly. Short call reserve periods are 12 to 14 hours long and are usually in 3 to 5 day blocks of reserve. Short call reserve is further broken down into AM reserve and PM reserve. AM reserves begin their 12 to 14 hour reserve period early in the morning and end in the early afternoon. PM reserves start their 12 to 14 hour reserve period later on in the morning and end in the evening. The second type of reserve that we're going to talk about is long call reserve, and it requires you to report to the airport through security with a minimum of 12 hours from the time that you were notified of the trip. Now, this obviously gives you a lot more flexibility and time to plan, and it's a lot more desirable of a type of reserve. So it usually goes to people that are more senior. For some pilots, this is even enough time for them to commute into base from somewhere else. Because long call reserve pilots are given so much notice, their reserve availability period is 24 hours a day during those blocks of reserve. So if you have a 5-day block of reserve where you're on long call reserve, for that whole 5 days from midnight to the following midnight of every single day, you can be called and notified of schedule changes by the company. The way that this works is that when you're notified, because you have 12 hours until you're required to report, when you're notified, you're released from your reserve period and given at least a 10-hour rest period before you report. And by doing that, everything is kept legal. A third type of reserve here that I should mention is ready reserve. This isn't assigned as an entire schedule like short call or long call, but rather is done on a day-to-day basis. So as a short call or long call reserve pilot, you may be assigned periods of ready reserve on a day-to-day basis. Ready reserve is an assignment where you wait in the airport in case any flying needs to be covered with very little notice. The basic structure of how flying is assigned to reserves is basically the same from airline to airline. First of all, reserve pilots can specify whether they want to be called for assignments or whether they would prefer not to be called for reserve assignments. This is usually referred to as a call first preference. Depending on how many consecutive days a pilot has on reserve, they'll be grouped into different buckets. For example, pilots with 3 days of reserve are going to be in the 3-day bucket. Pilots with 4 days of reserve are going to be in the 4-day bucket, and so on. Within each bucket, you're going to see pilots that are AM reserve, PM reserve, and long call reserve. When an assignment needs to be covered, they're going to look in the bucket that corresponds to the number of days that the trip is and look for a long call reserve pilot first if they can notify that person. If there's multiple long call reserve pilots that are notifiable, they're going to go to the most senior pilot that has a call first preference set to yes. If there are none, they're going to go to the long call reserve pilot that's most junior that has a call first preference set to no. If there's no long call reserve pilots available in that bucket, they'll go up to the next higher bucket and look for any long call reserve pilots in that one. After they've looked through all the other longer buckets for long call reserve pilots and they haven't found any, they'll go back to the bucket that corresponds to the length of the trip and they'll look at the short call reserve pilots. If the trip starts early in the morning and is more applicable to an AM reserve pilot, it'll be assigned to one of them following the same call first preference. If it starts at a later time that's more applicable to a PM reserve, they'll assign it to a PM reserve following that same call first preference order. Another factor in how reserve flying is assigned is the Federal Aviation Regulations Part 117 rest requirements for airline flight crew members. I'm not going to go into all of those in this video, but they're extremely important to know, so be sure to become familiar with those as well, as they're going to keep you out of trouble. As a new hire airline pilot, you're going to be on reserve for at least a couple months, and knowing the ins and outs of reserve is going to keep you legal and help you accomplish your goals as an airline pilot. Ask your questions about reserve in the comments section below. I'll do my best to answer as many as I possibly can. And if you haven't already, hit the subscribe button so you get more content like this about airline pilot life. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next video.